I'm very happy to introduce Emily Talon, who's Professor of Urbanism, the best person possible here at the university for today's symposium. And it's really, she'll tell you a lot more about the symposium today, but it's really addressing, as promised, a theme of great importance in that our cities were planned and zoned and legislated and regulated in times gone by, in some sense, and as technologies have changed, as policy circumstances have changed, as issues of social and racial justice has come more to the fore, there's really a need to reconceptualize how we use space, how we use public goods such as transportation and other amenities, and how all this is happening in the city. And so today we'll see a lot of analysis, a lot of discussions, and I think a lot of reflection, hopefully some ideas about how to rebalance our cities so that they become better places for everyone to live. So without much further ado, Emily Talon, thank you so much. She's really the heart and soul of today's symposium, and a great colleague here. So Emily, please take it away.
Too much pressure. I'm Emily Talon, urban planning professor here at the University of Chicago. Before we jump into things, I really need to thank Ann Dodge, Amy Giles, and Elaine Meyer for all the hard work putting the event together. Thank you to Louise for being supportive of this idea, and of course the Kreisman family for having the foresight to know that housing is so critical in everything we do having to do with the city. And of course, thanks to all the speakers and moderators for traveling here and helping us navigate through this very complex topic. Just a few comments to kind of frame our discussion. Essentially, we're here to talk about what I think is a fundamental injustice happening right before our eyes, not just in Chicago, but all across the country. And that injustice is called exclusion. Who gets to live where in the city? Who gets access to the qualities that make us want to live in cities, the best services, the best schools, access to transit and green space and amenities? This exclusion manifests itself in different ways, but one big way we have is when we have places in the city where only single-family housing is found. This happens either because multifamily housing is not allowed or because multifamily housing is not being preserved. It's being converted to something else, such as single family. In either case, multifamily housing, which is often more affordable and is therefore inclusive rather than exclusive, has been lost. Now, a lot of this is determined by market forces over which we have little control. But here's the rub. What if those exclusions are exclusions that we impose? We meaning our local government, and not the free market. And I'm talking, of course, about zoning. Zoning is the basic manual of instruction for how we build our cities. Zoning rules have tremendous power to shape our cities, even if we don't have a daily consciousness about that power. This means that we really need to take time to assess and understand what kind of cities are we creating with these rules. And the sad truth is that zoning, the rules, again, that we put in place, zoning is undermining a key societal goal, giving more people access to the benefits and amenities of the city. It's enabling and fostering exclusion. It does this in a number of ways. Two major ways are by prohibiting things such as multifamily housing, but also by turning a blind eye to the destruction of older multifamily housing exactly where it's most needed. In Chicago, this has reached crisis proportion. All over the city, older multifamily housing stock is being torn down and converted and replaced with high-income, luxury single-family housing. So zoning, in sum, is either prohibiting or failing to protect housing types that are intrinsically affordable. This is the very definition of exclusion. Anyone paying attention in the last decade to what cities need to be sustainable is that humans need to live compactly and they need to move around in shared ways other than their own private car. which is to say that we need housing density near transit. That's an absolutely core principle. But also core is that a good proportion of this transit accessible density needs to be affordable. And that means subsidy, yes, but it also means making sure that the rules we put in place enable and support and help the goal we're trying to reach, not get in the way of it or undermine it. This topic of zoning and equity and access and what it all has to do with the American dream of a single family house is perplexing and very politically challenging. I invite you to absorb the insights of our speakers today and to take part in this conversation.
So you heard that we at Neighbors for Neighbors believe that housing is a human right. Most progressive cities like Minneapolis and I suspect Chicago would probably agree. But history shows that we designed our cities and our policies to keep people out. And while today we say that we want a different result, those policies are still in place. My professional and advocate experience has taught me that the hard part is never what to do, it's how to get it done. If we want to end our housing shortage in Minneapolis, and as you must do here in Chicago, we have to address the reality, the political reality of what it takes to make change. Now, Neighbors for More Neighbors focuses on ending the many exclusionary policies that allow wealthier, whiter neighborhoods to avoid making space for more neighbors. It's one part of changing the rules. To skip past the expensive, time-consuming, home-blocking one-off battles to get permission to build enough homes. I want to be very clear about the limitations of ending single-family zoning. There is no way that this one change will fill the shortage of homes in our cities. The battle over single-family zoning is a proxy for power, for who gets to decide what and who is allowed in our cities. Neighbors from Our Neighbors led our allies into the political fray, and ending the apartment ban was key to the other zoning changes that have the scale that we need to shrink our shortage of homes. So here's the story of how we passed our comprehensive plan called Minneapolis 2040. To end the apartment ban, we had to make two things that are invisible visible. First, we had to reveal and wrestle with our city's racist history and the continuing legacy of those actions today. And then second, we had to have a very public power struggle to show that the political will exists to create a different and more just future. It's a story about government. So I'm going to talk about three clusters of characters. There are elected officials, there are city staff, and there are folks like Neighbors for More Neighbors outside of City Hall. Groups like ours are a critical part of that how to get things done, and we cannot do it alone. So as you listen today, I challenge you, as you listen to how we make those invisible things visible, I challenge you to think about how you fit into this story and ask yourself two things. First, what is your own role in your community's zoning story? Whether you're outside of City Hall, on staff, or someday will be, or hopefully as an elected official. Or second, in that role, what can you do to make change in your community? I promise that I will tell stories about people in purple sweatshirts and crowdsourced mapping by bike and promises to bulldoze every single neighborhood and political will. But getting there requires some history of how Minneapolis chose this path. The outlines of Minneapolis history are familiar to anyone who has studied American urban history. Settlers stole Dakota land. The logging and milling industries fueled rapid growth in the late 1800s. As our streetcar suburbs grew, racially restrictive covenants segregated our city, reinforced by FHA and GI Bill lending practices, and episodes like when a Black couple, Arthur and Edith Lee, faced a mob of 4,000 people demanding that they leave the home they had just purchased in South Minneapolis in 1931. Urban renewal and the 1960s construction of Interstates 94 and 35W decimated Black communities, and especially their commercial corridors. White flight hollowed out our tax base. Our history is typical of US cities, with one racist policy layered on top of another. Today, white Minneapolitans self-identify as progressives, and we identify as a progressive city, but we have largely forgotten those ugly parts of our history and lost sight of our worst in the nation racial disparities. Now that's where Mapping Prejudice, based at the University of Minnesota, one of those outside of City Hall characters, comes in. They launched in 2016, and they engaged 2,924 volunteers to comb through 177,343 historic documents, uncovering the history of how Minneapolis became segregated. They were searching for racial covenants, and they found about 30,000 of them. 110 years ago, Minneapolis wasn't segregated. That ugly part of our history started after an African-American couple, Madison and Amy Jackson, bought a home in Prospect Park. They knew that would be a challenge, and so they actually built a playground in the side yard that all of the neighborhood kids would come and play at to make sure that they were seen as good neighbors in that neighborhood. But soon after, they helped their friend William H. Simpson, who was also African-American, to build a house nearby. This was in 1909. And a crowd of more than 100 showed up to protest their new neighbors in a conflict that a local paper headlined, "A Race War in Prospect Park." In Minneapolis, the first racially restrictive deed appeared 1 year later in 1910. The deed in that transaction contained what would become a common restriction. It's shown on this slide. Those covenants created demographic patterns that remain in place in Minneapolis today. Residential segregation reinforces other disparities in employment and education and health and almost anything that we measure in our cities today. I think I have another video to play here. I want to show you what Mapping Prejudice did with this data. They created an animated map of racial covenants, and it shows how these deeds sprouted and spread across the city and county. They're now doing similar work in Ramsey County to encompass St. Paul. Their workshops point out to those volunteers how, after the Minnesota legislature prohibited their use in 1953, the city of Minneapolis stepped in with exclusionary zoning for wealthy white neighborhoods. So images like this map and being an active part of the research process, reading those covenants, is prompting many white Minneapolitans to reflect on how, while we didn't create it, we benefit from the system. To change it, you have to make that history visible. People don't know about racially restrictive deeds. People don't know that zoning is systematically exclusionary. You have to connect those dots. So I want to move on to the next slide now. So this history is important because in Minneapolis, we are constantly fed the story of our exceptionalism. We're near the top of all sorts of lists. We have the best park system, we have the best biking city. It turns out that we also top the list of the biggest racial disparities. In one example, 3 out of 4 white families own their homes. That's that orange line at the top. But only 1 in 4 black families do. That yellow line at the bottom, that's been dropping since 1950. At the same time that Mapping Prejudice was gaining recognition, former Mayor Betsy Hodges could point to some progress that she had had working inside of City Hall. She was working to make sure we could recognize both the reality of those massive racial disparities and city government's role in protecting the status quo. After years of advocacy and leadership from our city council, when she was a candidate for mayor, she made ending racial disparities the center of her mayoral campaign. And then she kept that promise when she was in her administration. So by 2016, she had changed hiring policies and city staff looked more like city residents. There's now a division of race and equity that consults to city departments on the racial impact of any policies that are passed. Proposed policies are must always undergo that analysis. Now, Mayor Hodges not only gave staff permission to change how City Hall did business, she charged staff with addressing those racial disparities in everything that the city did. So in 2016, as we were approaching the state-mandated comprehensive planning process, this and the data and stories for mapping prejudice was at the core of those city planners' thinking. This aligned with the 2016 emergence of Renters United for Justice, or Inquilinos Unidos, IX, as a tenant organizing dynamo. They have led the work revealing the reality of what renters face in Minneapolis. They've focused on organizing some of the most vulnerable renters in our city, often immigrants with or without papers who have very low incomes. In 2018, Vanessa Del Campo Chacon told her story to MinPost. Once a teacher pointed out to her that her daughter never crawled. Vanessa realized that it was because she was very anxious about leaving her on the floor because of mice and insects. Timothy Brown on the right here told his story in Shelter Force. He said, "My house isn't weatherproofed for the winter, which is unbearably cold in Minneapolis. Last year, I lived through the entire winter without heat because my landlord refused to fix the house and the heating system." IX had organized renters to fight and share their stories in the news at the same time that rents were increasing rapidly and renters had few options to move. Housing stable renters and people with fixed rate mortgages, we are insulated from what low-income renters in the Twin Cities face. Without IX telling those stories, Minneapolitans can't imagine the lives that they live. These and their allies made tenants' rights, affordable housing, and displacement a central theme in local elections in 2017. Now, finally, there was a community of volunteers who were writing and thinking about local government and what kind of city they wanted to live in. It coalesced around a group blog called Streets MN and the bicycle coalition called Our Streets Minneapolis. And then it really took off when a guy named John Edwards founded Wedge Live. John was radicalized when he attended a neighborhood meeting for a proposed apartment building. He'd expected the proposal to be a slam dunk, an obvious asset because it was in a mostly renter neighborhood. It would increase the property tax base. It was the intersection of two high-frequency transit lines. What was there not to love? Instead, he found opposition that dehumanized renters, and that dehumanization, that language, that radicalized him. His response to that meeting was to found this hyper-local news organization called Wedge Live, and then he started to live tweet his own neighborhood's meetings. And over time, he's expanded to covering the Planning Commission and local political news. So that brings us to where we were when the city's long-range planning staff started to work on Minneapolis 2040. So while 2040 is primarily a land use planning process, Minneapolis uses the comp plan to outline the next decade of policy work for everything that the city touches. Our three characters were all primed for the plan. The city of Minneapolis was 2 miles into a marathon to eliminate racial disparities, strongly supported by Mayor Hodges and the city council. Folks outside of City Hall, mapping prejudice, IX, and the local community following Wedge Live, focused the conversation on addressing historic wrongs, on housing and housing affordability, and they made the workings of local government much more accessible. City Hall staff, like the long-range planners, knew that this plan was critical and the opportunity of their careers if they wanted to do something really meaningful that would have a long-term impact. The planners also had experience that had taught them how political this work was going to be. This is when we shift from recognizing our history to wrestling with the racially disparate outcomes experienced in Minneapolis today. The planners started the entire process by naming a historic problem with civic engagement. Historically, people of color and indigenous communities, renters, and people from low-income backgrounds have been underrepresented in civic processes. They designed their plan to address exactly that problem of underrepresentation. They pitched and secured a significant budget for community engagement from the city council, and they re-envisioned what the entire planning process would look like. So that budget gave planners the resources to host a totally different kind of process. The space to document support for a different kind of plan came with that money as well. The 3-year engagement process centered the voices of people who typically don't participate. It would also counteract the politics that they knew were coming a couple of years in the future. Early phases before the process was public included community dialogues in and hosted by those typically underrepresented cultural communities, like the East African community and the Metropolitan Urban Indian directors. They were invite only. They were not public. Nobody could come if they weren't invited to participate. They also showed up at every cultural and neighborhood festival, asking big questions that anybody can answer, like, how will your housing needs change between now and 2040? The same year, Wedge Live's John Edwards and his Twitter friend, Ryan Johnson, were joking about all of the development-opposing Facebook group. This time it was called Minneapolis Neighbors United. They were trading their own made-up, sarcastic, redundant, meaningless word soup group names, and one of them said, Neighbors United Against Having More Neighbors. Suddenly, it crystallized for them that what they were fighting for was more neighbors. That became the positive, sincere version, Neighbors for More Neighbors. They started tweeting about why building more homes was important. They created a More Neighbors Twitter account, and they started making some humorous art. The art caught the attention of a reporter at Slate, and not long after, just a couple of weeks, their art and their story was featured on Slate. Their following grew, and they began posting action alerts for apartment projects, like the one that needed community support. So there's now one. It's a project for youth aging out of foster care a couple of blocks from my own home. Their following, we all showed up, and there was a noticeable increase in how often projects received Planning Commission approval. Now, all of this was also happening during a city election year. The 2040 champion on the Minneapolis City Council was Lisa Bender, and she is trained as a planner. She was strategizing how to keep all of the Minneapolis 2040 work on track. Before the election, the planners working on Minneapolis 2040 developed a set of 14 goals based on what they had heard in those community dialogues and at festivals. They include the goals on this screen. The City Council formally adopted them. In liberal Minneapolis, the proposed values were unassailable, and it was an opportunity for council members seeking re-election to publicly show their positions and their support for a more just city, even if that didn't necessarily match their historic votes. That also bound the planning staff to organize the plan around these same formally adopted values. Now, back to the planning staff, the engagement shifted to a new, more public phase. At these events, they framed up the activities by reminding us of our values, that list of 14 on the previous slide. They also reminded us of the challenges we face with charts like that homeownership disparity chart or the rising rents that we face in our city. They asked us big questions, again, things that we could answer like, how do you get around the city today? How do you think your transportation needs will change between now and 2040? They hired social practice artists to design engagement activities at formal events. So this that I'm showing you now is TV 2040. It's a fake television game show program. It's being recorded live in 2040. It's a trivia show. And the participants are the contestants are the random meeting attendees plucked from the meeting who showed up at the event. Poets who had manual typewriters would ask people question prompts, and then they would, on the spot, write poetry, capturing their answers. Every event was full of kid-friendly activities with Play-Doh and scissors and art projects and lots of markers. Adults were taking their opinions seriously, and the meetings were full of engaged kids, really excited to imagine what their life would be like 20 years in the future and to ask the planners to make a city that would let them come true. So from mobile-friendly commenting to fun events with free food, the city planners re-envisioned public engagement to feel more like the Minnesota State Fair, one of the most fun things that we do in Minnesota, and not like a typical public meeting shouting match. They invited us into the conversation and they told us what they had heard at earlier meetings. They used the poetry that came out of those conversations. They used the comments from that game show and they shared that back with us. We could tell that they were taking our ideas seriously. All of those quiz show answers and drawings and sculptures, those are part of the formal record. At every meeting, when they reflected it back to us and they told us what we had to say, they asked us what would come next to dig one part deeper into the plan. And because it was fun and we could see that we were heard, thousands of new people did show up. The input was different. It was supporting change. So as a result, that gave those CPED planners permission to propose big, exciting ideas that motivated people to come out in support. In the Minneapolis 2040 draft, the long-range planners cited mapping prejudice and connected the dots of how history created segregation and racial housing disparities today. I'm going to read one important quote from the plan. Racial disparities persist in all aspects of housing. Until the 1960s, zoning regulations, racially discriminatory housing practices, and federal housing policies worked together to determine who could live in single-family houses in desirable neighborhoods. These determinations were based on race and have shaped the opportunities granted to multiple generations of Minneapolis residents. Immediately following that quote in the plan was a stark chart showing homeownership by race and ethnicity in Minneapolis on the right side here. That yellow line on the top, that's white Minneapolitans. The plan identified how every part of the city had a role to play in dismantling these systems. Now, this was the first time that we called on the most exclusive parts of Minneapolis to be part of the solution beyond simply paying taxes. This was the first step in dismantling exclusionary zoning, where whiteness was named, where status quo felt challenged. This call to action in the 2040 draft primed the engagement process to make something else that is typically invisible visible, showing that there is political will for a very different future. And now I'm heading into the part of the story that you may have read about, where the controversy erupts. One of the hundreds of ideas in the plan was allowing fourplexes on any lot in the city. Now, someone who had attended a private city council briefing leaked the fourplexes anywhere to the Star Tribune. And this headline leaked weeks before the plan was formally released. Now, given how common fourplexes are in Minneapolis, and given how much Minneapolitans love to reminisce about their years renting in a fourplex and how it's some of the best years of their life, I'm still surprised at what happened next. But that leak drew all of the attention around the plan. It set the terms of the coming debate, and it triggered an extraordinary amount of opposition. A crew of people came out to defend single-family zone neighborhoods. They distributed lots of apocalyptic red signs, claiming that the city was going to bulldoze neighborhoods and mandate people to bulldoze their own properties. One of their core organizers included a sitting elected official, and she used her bullet pulpit every chance that she got. Another one of their organizers was a former city council member who had chaired the zoning committee. These were folks who knew their way around City Hall and their processes. These were folks who had lots of very wealthy, influential connections. So this is where our social media stars come up with their own Neighbors for More name. The ones who came up with the Neighbors for Neighbors name applied their humor and skill to letting people know what was going on. Wedge Live by John Edwards offered well-researched tweets and blog posts about anti-2040 organizing all year. One highlight was reporting that the anti-bulldozing legal battle was run by a guy who bulldozed his own home in order to build a bigger house. Ryan Johnson is our other local hero, and he organized volunteers who biked every single block of Minneapolis to locate all of those red bulldoze signs. Now, he's good with mapping and technology, and he mapped them against redlining maps. That's on the left. He mapped them against property value data. That's on the right. He wrote a blog post with a headline that read, "High property wealth and homeownership is the connecting thread among those strongly opposed to Minneapolis 2040 comprehensive plan." Ryan and John led our social media program the entire 2040 campaign. Now, Neighbors for More Neighbors needed to do more than just shitposting on Twitter. So we also launched a traditional organizing approach. That was where I got really heavily involved. We drew in hundreds of volunteers, and it's important to take a moment to talk about who we are. You saw some of us in that video. We also include people who administer Section 8 voucher programs, whose clients can't find places that will accept their vouchers because of the tight rental market. We include seniors who want different kinds of options where they can stay in their neighborhoods and downsize from their big homes, and who want to make sure that their grandkids have the same opportunities that they had. We include fourplex owners like me. I also have worked in subsidized affordable housing for more than 20 years. I know why this zoning matters to that subsidized housing work. Our supporters were more likely to be people whose voices are missing in the conversations: young people and transplants and renters. We organized hard. As Neighbors for More Neighbors, we had to let people know what the comprehensive plan is. I mean, who knows what a comprehensive plan is if you didn't go to planning school and don't work in City Hall? We had to convey that very clearly again and again and again. We had to convey why it was important, that it was important that they showed up and that their voices mattered. We had to let them know when and where and how to show up. We reminded people to ask that neighborhood zoning re-legalize the kind of homes like this that already exist in our cities and have for 100 years that are currently illegal under the zoning code. We reminded them to ask to allow more homes close to useful things like transit and grocery stores and schools and parks. We asked them to ask to eliminate parking requirements, to re-legalize single-room occupancy apartments, and also to express their support for fourplexes. This is one of the Meeting in a Box events that we helped organize. The city planners were focusing their time and attention on engaging the communities who don't engage in city planning processes. And they knew that folks like us, who tend to be whiter and have a little more education, also wanted to be involved. And so they created a kit that we could self-administer called a Meeting in a Box. So this is one of those Meeting in a Box meetings that we hosted. It was important to us because one of our members, who's a woman of color, is uncomfortable attending public meetings because she's experienced harassment at those public meetings and she doesn't want to go back. We also sent out instructions on how to comment from home. The city had an excellent comment website, and so that made it easy for us to help walk people through that. Bikers could help with that mapping or deliver yard signs to anyone across the city. Extroverts could table at open streets, where we learned that those bulldozer sign people were actually some of our greatest allies. It was pretty common for someone to come up to us and ask, "Are you the opposite of those red sign people?" And after a short conversation, walk home with a purple Neighbors for More Neighbors sign. Everyone came and participated in walk-in talks with our city council members, where we made sure to point out the fourplexes in their wards that they'd never noticed before. Activists reached out to their networks of likely allies working in labor and transportation and climate. We wrote blog posts and pitched our friends and neighbors. I pitched my tenants, gently, I hope. And we talked to the media. We flogged every single public meeting, and people did show up, hundreds of people, and different people than usually show up. We could see how our engagement shaped the plan. It was especially rewarding when the revised plan came out to see your own words and the themes that you'd offered and the comments that you'd written show up in that revised draft. Now, despite all of this organizing and the welcoming process that city planners had created, there were plenty of people who still didn't show up. This more traditional comment part of the engagement process, not everyone can. Yes, the public meetings had food and childcare and translators and fun activities, and the people who showed up did reflect that work and were different than before. And it is also true that fewer disabled people, fewer Black and Indigenous people, fewer people who speak Spanish or Somali at home, fewer people who work lower paid service and second and third shift jobs attended than live in Minneapolis. The planners had prepared for this. If you remember those values, they started with that intentional invitation-only outreach to those same communities early on. And then using those festivals, they reached that more representative audience to define those community values. And this piece was critical. They included the input in those meetings in the public record, but most importantly, when the council adopted these values as part of the plan, these values, these principles became the structure supporting the entire plan, the beams and the joists that hold the whole thing together. That structure could not be erased by the public comment. Now, by the end of 2018, we were nearing formal passage of the plan, and the activities shifted to a more traditional public engagement theater. It's the kind of thing that civically engaged people are pretty familiar with. There were countless meetings, I think it was 144, in churches and park buildings where people shouted at Heather Worthington. She was the long-range planning director at the time. At Neighbors for Neighbors, we kept encouraging people to attend those, but also to keep submitting supportive comments and contacting their elected leaders, because there is widespread support for making space for more people in Minneapolis. We made it our job to turn them out. And that support is kind of yeah, that's a great idea. Thumbs up. It's not I totally want to go down to City Hall and stand in front of that intimidating dais and testify before the City Council kind of support. We did organize people to testify at City Hall. And at the two meetings, the majority of testifiers were slightly in support of the plan. Now, we used purple sweatshirts to make this testifying more accessible. And let me walk a little bit through that, right? Ryan, this is a different Ryan on this picture here. He reminded us all how intimidating it is to go down to City Hall. And he also reminded us that it can be more comfortable if when you get there, you can find your own people. So we encouraged everybody to wear purple if they were in support of Minneapolis 2040. And then he took a trip with his roller bag to Target, filled it up with purple sweatshirts, and handed it out to supporters who didn't have their own purple to bring down to City Hall. We turned the two multi-hour sessions of public comment into a party, a community organizing party, as our members waited to be the 100th or the 119th person to comment on the plan. Peggy, our honorary Neighbors for More Neighbors mom at the time, she brought a purse full of snacks. We sat around clustered on the floor in the halls, watching the testimony on monitors or sitting in the overflow room. When that elected official, who was one of the self-appointed leader of the opposition, tried to persuade a young Neighbors for More Neighbors member that she was wrong and she should speak up against the plan, we were there to support our friend and to cheer her on. That harassment actually turned out to be helpful for us because she had shown up to support her boyfriend and watched the testimony, not to testify herself. That pushed her to get her name on the list, and she was one of the very last testifiers. In the end, while the local media did portray the story as contentious, at least the triplex part, with more anti than pro feedback, our voices were heard. And for that, here's where we needed to have that last partner beyond the outside of City Hall support, beyond the smart planning team, show up. We needed the elected officials on our city council. In that 2017 local election, a year earlier, organizing had elected a progressive city council, and organizers had made affordable housing a big election issue. And I want to add that Minneapolis is a Democratic city. Our city council is split between Democrats and one Green. We have the kind of city council everybody expects to support all of those values on that 14 value plan. When you look at people's votes, we have a very split city council with most of the time slightly less than half of the council voting for progressive things, thinking about how we address police violence, how we make sure we have abundant affordable housing, and the other half comfortably supporting the status quo as their members or as their constituents seem to prefer, or they're happy to not pay attention. So electing a progressive city council was a really big deal. So just as helpful as electing that progressive city council, there was that champion on the city council who spent 3 years setting the stage for this particular vote. Lisa Bender was chair of the Planning and Zoning Committee in her first term, where she carefully laid the foundation for Minneapolis 2040. She built consensus for reforms that legalized accessory dwelling units throughout the entire city in 2014, and also that reduced or eliminated parking requirements near transit corridors in 2015. She shepherded through that pre-election vote, formally adopting the set of values in the Minneapolis 2040 plan that it was built around, so that the work completed before the election could not be set aside no matter what happened in the election. Her second term, she was elected president of the city council, where she continued to bring initially skeptical progressive colleagues along. So the council as a whole, after seeing the stories from Mapping Prejudice, after joining those Neighbors for More Neighbors walk-in talks, after working with city council staff and 2 years of discussion and skilled negotiating by Council President Bender, the city council understood why it was important to support this big plan. After a year of sitting behind the dais, they had figured out that people opposing things show up and people supporting them do not. And yet with this plan, we did. They needed and they saw that they had community support. So the vote on the plan was hard, and most of our elected leaders took that hard vote. The remarkable 12-1 vote in favor of the bold Minneapolis 2040 plan that eliminates many pieces of our exclusionary zoning. It does much more as well. That was a big step towards building a different future. It wasn't easy, and we are not done. We passed Minneapolis 2040, but the comprehensive plan, didn't change the underlying zoning. It merely obligated the city council to do that, thanks to a quirk of Minnesota state law where the comprehensive plan takes precedence over the zoning code. So Neighbors for More Neighbors immediately shifted our focus to holding the city accountable to implementing the zoning and parking reforms that were in the plan. Now, when we announced this, members said that they didn't understand zoning and they weren't confident working on it. And so we responded by creating Game of Zones. It's a gamified workshop, and it teaches players about floor area ratios, setbacks, lot areas, variances. We're also supporting other groups working on other aspects of the plan, like affordable housing investments, inclusionary zoning, and tenants' rights. Now, it's been a couple of years, right? The plan passed in December of 2018. The first changes to the zoning code, the triplex changes happened in January of 2019. And we're starting to see changes on the ground because development takes years. As predicted, the changes with the greatest impact had nothing to do with ending single-family zoning. But that single-family zoning debate is what allowed the more important changes to slip into the plan, largely unnoticed by the opposition that was focused on maintaining our universal apartment ban. First, the plan signaled that Minneapolis wanted to see growth to the developers. They said, we want to see more homes, lots more homes. That signal has been heard by the builders. The year after the plan passed, we saw a jump in the number of homes proposed in Minneapolis. The Planning Commission leapt from 2,600 housing unit approvals in 2015 to 5,077 in 2020. That was possible only with that increase in applications that was most likely triggered by this conversation saying, yes, we want more homes, we want more neighbors. Now, when it comes to zoning, the first change was legalizing up to 3 housing units on any lot in the city, although it didn't include any changes to make it easier to fit 3 units into a building. We also passed inclusionary zoning and lifted anti-roommate zoning rules. More recently, our Game of Zones players led advocacy updating what the city calls built form regulations around floor area ratios and setbacks. As a result, triplexes did get they get a little more flexibility in their size. Parking requirements have been totally eliminated. SROs are again legal, and ADUs have more flexibility. They no longer are limited to owner-occupied lots. The financing system and the builder pipeline for triplexes and ADUs has yet to catch up with that new flexibility. But still, the numbers are slowly growing, with duplex and triplex construction adding just over 50 units each of the last 2 years. Again, compare that with the 5,000 units approved in 2019. We are now working on tenant protections and helping people pay for what housing costs as well. The first tenant protections passed in Minneapolis included tenant screening ordinance with a limited look back, and it also caps damage deposits. We passed a $15 minimum wage around the same time. We're funding local housing vouchers, and we continue to invest in subsidized housing. So, what are the results? In 2018, a Neighbors for More Neighbors volunteer wrote a blog post, and it was calculating how many homes we need each year. The city added 47,000 people between 2010 and 2020. And so his calculation needed to include how do we make up for our housing shortage and also build enough to accommodate that population growth. He found that we need a little under 4,000 new homes each year. So for our results, what have we built since 2020? I, a couple of weeks ago, calculated the answer. It's around 3,740 units built each year the last 4 years. We are seeing some shifts in our housing market as a result of that as well. This is from a blog post that I published a couple of weeks ago, where we are seeing advertised rents drop. It started the year before the pandemic. We did also see that drop in rents that happened nationally with the pandemic, but post-pandemic, it looks like rents are rebounding very dramatically in other large metros, whereas advertised rents in Minneapolis are flat or have continued dropping. The impact of each city policy change, it layers on top of all of the others. And the first homes allowed explicitly because of Minneapolis 2040, they're coming available just now. So these buildings and those zoning updates, that progress is not going to be undone. But it's not all roses. In 2021, the city election focused on policing after George Floyd's murder and the uprising. And we lost several progressive council members, in particular, the ones who were some of the strongest leaders in 2040 implementation. While Minneapolis 2040 was a non-issue in the election, that shift puts the next set of tenant protections, tenant opportunity to purchase, rent stabilization, just cause eviction. It puts those protections at risk. Progress on the next round of zoning changes, and these are the ones that we think will make the biggest difference in allowing for more homes. It's updating the base zoning and allowing somewhat larger buildings along transit corridors. Those are moving very slowly, and we haven't yet found our city council champion. We also need to protect against rollbacks. In the last few months, the Planning Commission has allowed projects that don't comply with some 2040 guidelines because they were too small. So some of 2040 mandates a minimum height, and those buildings were allowed even though they didn't meet that minimum height. The Planning Commission also denied this particular rezoning, ignoring staff recommendations that would have been consent agenda items 6 months ago. And that puts the city at risk of a lawsuit. This spring, one neighborhood is organizing around a comp plan amendment to downzone their community. So we at Neighbors for More Neighbors, we will keep working to protect those wins and continue that implementation. Now, before I wrap up, I'm handing this back to you. You heard about how elected leaders made space for staff to approach the plan differently and how elected leaders took hard votes to pass the plan. You heard about how staff re-envisioned the planning process to get a better outcome for our city's idea that fits our city's idea of itself rather than an easier and politically less contentious approach. You heard about how many different communities and community groups organized before and during and after the process. All of that is about creating a more just city. So I ask you to take a moment again and think about where do you fit in as a community member, a current or future public staff member, or an elected official. And then, as you reflect on your own current role or future role, I want you to take a moment to think about what can you do to influence? What can you do so that Chicago can make the changes that you need to begin to rectify those harms created by your history? The battle over single-family zoning is a proxy for power, over who gets to decide what and who is allowed in our cities. Neighbors for More Neighbors led our allies into the political fray, and ending the apartment ban was key to the other policy changes that are shrinking our shortage of homes. Groups like ours are part of that How to Get It Done, and we cannot do it alone. Every person in your city has a place in making that change happen. So I challenge each of you to find your place, to find what you can do to make that change in your own city. I hear I get to take some questions.
Yes.
Jake has offered to field questions, so I have a question. Should I start? Yana, thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. I had a question actually on the one slide you had with that new apartment building that was very modern and very boxy with these more traditional gabled, I don't know, were those single family homes or maybe they were apartments? But my question is, people could look at that and say, I don't want that big ugly box in my neighborhood. And I wondered if there were some design considerations such that the apartment buildings and the higher density would be more palatable to people.
So certainly our zoning code has a lot to say about design considerations. We hear lots of complaints about the exterior materials piece of it, and also around the articulated facade part of the zoning code. And I do not believe that concerns about character and fitting in are what people are actually testifying about when they go to City Hall and when they write emails to oppose new homes in their community. I think that they are searching for things that are recognized in formal policy documents to use as justifications for opposition. So things like eliminating parking minimums, things like setting clear and predictable expectations about what is and isn't okay, including design considerations. When they are embedded in the code and the code is buildable, then that changes the conversation because you don't have to do the public process, at least the way it works in Minneapolis, right? If it's by right under the zoning code in Minneapolis, you go to the permitting office, right? You get the approval from city staff. If it needs a variance and our current zoning code, almost nothing can get through without a variance, it goes to the Planning Commission. And that opens Pandora's box of engagement. So we have focused hard on who belongs in our city, and the answer to that is everyone. And we have focused on if we don't make space for people, when you have 47,000 more people come to the city, and that's a 12% population increase for us. Maybe sounds small in Chicago, but for us, it's a lot of people. It's the first growth we've seen in decades, right? When you've got all those folks coming to the city, if you don't make space, it is very, very clear that that is a policy choice to push people out. And we know that anytime there's a shortage of things, the people who don't have it are the people who can't afford it, the people with the least means, the people with the least power.
I worked at the University of Chicago in the law library for a long time. I'm here, though, because I live across the street. So my question is directed at you, but it's really for everyone in the room. The question is the Mansueto Institute and this project ready to take on Woodlawn as a project, as a start? Here's a neighborhood that is starting to turn around. The University of Chicago is interested to the degree that, well, we'll go down to 63rd Street, but there are empty lots, there's properties involved, and we've got to make some decisions in our neighborhood to start the process that you described.
Thank you for asking that question. It's an important question, and I hope that there is space for that conversation here. I want to name it's also a very complicated question. Now, I don't know Chicago neighborhoods at all, so I can't read the layers of power and race and income that are certainly embedded in that question. And I want to encourage you, as you think about what is the right thing to do here, to think about how do we make sure and protect the people whose lives and communities and histories are threatened by change. And that change is both disinvestment and the lack of amenities, but it also, if it's not done well, could be cultural displacement or physical displacement because of changing economics in a community. And I think it is possible to address all of those things at the same time. The research is starting to show that building abundant homes does make nearby housing less expensive. And I know that housing costs are a massive challenge for you. And it's not simple. So good luck as you face that challenge. I would encourage you to think bigger than just a small area, because a small area tends to trigger political fights, and doing something bigger and broader, if you can get that done, relieves the pressure that might land on a single small upzoned area. So with our zoning changes in Minneapolis, it was citywide. That didn't put the pressure on any particular neighborhood, and certainly not on the historically disinvested neighborhoods that previously had borne all of the population growth. It said wealthy, white, we call them racially concentrated areas of wealth, must do their part. We cannot simply put this burden on historically redlined, disproportionately people of color neighborhoods to once again accommodate all of the change in our city. So I don't know what that looks like here. Good luck.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. This was an amazing presentation. You talked a lot about how resident engagement and really comprehensive engagement was very important to the Minneapolis 2040 plan. And you specifically mentioned a lot of really creative strategies like comprehensive youth engagement and, creating those like game of zones kind of activities. Do you know how much of that resident engagement strategy is now, a permanent fixture of the way the city of Minneapolis does things, or is that kind of unique to the 2040 plan?
Let's see, this question about engagement and how do you engage residents turns out to be one I get very excited about because I have very strong opinions. I think that some of the habits are embedded and that it's clear that our public meetings are more accessible and it's less shouting meetings and more open houses that have some interactive features at them. I am also personally really exhausted and tired of public meetings. And so I think that engagement was a fantastic investment for a big 20-year visioning plan, for something that touches everything the city does for the next 20 years. That is exactly where public engagement funds should, in my opinion, be invested. I am sick and tired of going to meetings there's a street in front of my house that is very noisy and loud and a heavy transit user bike walk corridor. I'm really tired of going to public meetings about that street because every one of our plans, the comprehensive plan, Minneapolis 2040, our transportation action plan, our bike plan, our transit plan, the list goes on and on. They all say that should be a transit priority corridor that has wide sidewalks and safe places to bike. We are fighting that battle right now. So even though that is on every map in the city of Minneapolis and every formally adopted policy, we have to refight that battle. I personally think that is an inappropriate space for public engagement because we made the policy decision years ago. 10 years ago, I think, was when it was on the bike map. We should not be relitigating that. And so figuring out when is the right time to do engagement, how do you do it so that you can connect with people who don't have time to show up to public meeting after public meeting after public meeting about tiny things and get yelled at and ignored, right? Like you need to find the right balance. and the right instances to do that. So I guess I have kind of tender feelings about this because I go to too many public meetings, and in June the weather is precious and beautiful, and I don't want to go to 3 public meetings a week to say, yes, I tonight again think it's good to have an apartment building here where our zoning code map says we should have an apartment building. We've made that decision. Let's follow through.
Hi, thanks so much for being here, sharing. I'm curious if you have a sense of, so you all did, Neighbors for More Neighbors did this incredible community engagement. I'm curious if you have a sense of how much of the organizing that you did during this process um, has translated into like some of those people continuing to be engaged in organizing around housing or other things in their community. Like, have you all's membership base grown? What has that looked like?
So I don't have concrete numbers about how the 2040 organizing has translated into other organizing going forward. I do know that I keep seeing people who I first met during 2040 at other public meetings in other organizing spaces, working on city council campaigns. So I believe that it has, and we were part of that story. I do not want to minimize the work of the Streets MN blog or Our Streets Minneapolis or Wedge Live or IX. There are dozens and dozens of groups who are doing on the ground, door knocking, and other kinds of engagement and organizing that are building a collaborative progressive movement in Minneapolis. It is a hard fight. People are very tired. I will say the uprising after George Floyd's murder was exhausting for everybody in the city. It was followed by a bunch more local political fights that are also very exhausting. And people keep showing up. We're also trying to carry each other through the exhaustingness of these few years so that when we recover, we will still be able to organize. So I don't have numbers, but I know that I keep seeing more and more faces and the same faces that I saw before.